In Arabia, almost a century ago, a war began that would lead to the creation of the modern Middle East. At its epicenter was an Englishman whose role would become legendary. He would build vital alliances with the Arabs and fight alongside them in a war of liberation.
Ahora, yella!
Then he would play his part in betraying them.
This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Name?
Ross John Hume, 352087, sir.
It was a false name. The new recruit was Lawrence of Arabia.
Height? 5'6".
After the war, he went into hiding and would spend his middle age as an ordinary air craftsman in the Royal Air Force.
34, just. What are these?
Superficial wounds, sir.
God. And these? Punishment?
Persuasion, sir.
Where were you?
Internment in Turkey, sir. Or in the East.
The scars were a reminder that he would never be free of Arabia.
Lawrence of Arabia, Prince of Mecca, uncrowned King of the Desert.
Images of Lawrence and the Arab army were played in theaters around the world. These were the years immediately after the First World War. The public, exhausted by reports of the horrific conflict in Europe, were captivated by the story of this romantic warrior.
Lawrence was a military leader. He had that presence. You feel they're touched, if not by the divine, by some special quality that makes them different, makes them special, and make people want to follow them.
Lawrence was a man of legend. He was a complex man. Sometimes he put himself as a very ordinary and very poor and very small man, and sometimes he inflated his image to an unbelievable size.
He was a rebel. He played the system, he understood the system, and he got away with things that normal individuals just wouldn't get away with. He was a significant player who affected history.
The legacy of the Desert War and Lawrence's role in it would have a huge impact on the Arab world.
The political landscape of the Middle East, the relationship of the Middle East with the other parts of the world, the relationship of the components part of the Middle East with each other have all been laid down at that moment.
The film show made Lawrence a celebrity. The public was thrilled by him. The press hunted him. But the hugeness of what he had been involved in, his own fame, and his guilt at what he had done threatened to overwhelm him. Lawrence was 20 when he first arrived in the Middle East. He had been preparing himself for this journey since childhood. Lawrence had been born into a family of private means, but a family running from a secret. His parents had never married. His father had abandoned his first wife for the family's governess. Lawrence and his brothers spent their early years on the move, living in Wales, Scotland, France, and the Channel Islands. The family eventually settled in Oxford under the assumed name of Lawrence at number 2 Polstead Road.
Okay, let's measure you. Come on, let me do that. Against the door.
The young Lawrence would grow up very conscious of his height. His younger brothers would soon outgrow him.
25th.
He would only ever be 5 foot 5.5 inches tall.
He knew from the beginning that he was illegitimate. He had that knowledge of being outside of the established structure, and that liberated him to be creative in some particular ways that probably would not have been available to children more conventionally brought up.
He spent most of his time alone, determined to prove himself. He would go without meals, work through the nights, and force himself through physical tests, cycling dozens of miles a day through the Oxfordshire countryside. His great passion was for all things medieval. He became fascinated by the Crusades, reading books about epic battles, codes of chivalry, and legendary heroes. It was his passion for the history of the Crusades that would take him to the Middle East. As an undergraduate from Oxford University, he had chosen to study the design of the great Crusader castles. It was an exotic and dangerous destination for a young student traveling alone.
Hosn is the finest castle in the world, certainly the most picturesque. Quite marvelous. Sayoun was, I think, the most sensational thing in castle building I have ever seen.
In 3 months, he walked 1,100 miles. He would go many weeks without seeing another European face.
I have been on foot and alone all the time, so that I have perhaps, living as an Arab with the Arabs, got a better insight into daily life than those who travel with a caravan. The hospitality is something more than a name. The common people are each ready to allow me to share their meals without thought of payment. I will have such difficulty in becoming English again.
Wandering through villages near the Euphrates, his trip nearly came to a premature end.
Dear Mother, the adventures continue. Read something in the Aleppo paper about my being nearly murdered. Absurd. I suppose all my exercise is responsible for my good health.
In fact, Lawrence knew he had been lucky to escape with his life.
To be blasé and to dismiss something as nothing is part of the heroic mystique. Not only was I went through great hardship and pain, but it's nothing to me. I can handle it with great ease. I mean, that fits the dynamic of heroism.
Lawrence returned to Oxford so thin that one of his own professors did not recognize him.
A man came up to me who I did not know, but when he spoke in his low, quick voice, I found that it was Lawrence.
His thesis was singled out as utterly remarkable. Lawrence was gaining a reputation for his knowledge of the region. Leading historians and archaeologists were taking notice of him. He earned himself his first job, a position as an archaeologist back in the Middle East. In the next 7 years, Lawrence would watch the region slide into war and the world around him change forever. His base was the important historical site of Karkamish, at the junction of the great trade routes to Damascus and Baghdad. The archaeologists employed local Arabs on the excavation. Here, Lawrence gained his confidence working with the Arabs, all the time improving his grasp of the language and his skills as a leader of men. He earned their respect and trust. On one occasion, intervening to stop a German engineer from beating his Arab workers, Lawrence threatened to thump the man if he tried it again. It was also here that he met Dahum. Dahum had joined the dig as a water boy. Lawrence picked him out to help him learn Arabic and trained him as his photographic assistant. There has been speculation about the extent of their friendship.
Lawrence had a very close relationship, a real fondness for Dahum. Whether they had an active gay relationship, who knows? But there are some curiosities. I mean, they used to do things like exchange clothing and take pictures of each other. Bit strange. The local workers there thought that there was a homosexual relationship between them, but people have said that Lawrence was just building that up. He liked to shock. And in fact, there was actually nothing but an innocent but genuinely affectionate relationship between the two of them.
The relationship would be one of the most important in Lawrence's life and become perhaps his inspiration. A decade later, Lawrence would write 7 Pillars of Wisdom, his account of the war in the desert. It would become one of the most celebrated books in the English language. S.A. was Sheikh Ahmed, Dahum's real name.
I loved you, so I drew these tides of men into my hands and wrote my will across the sky in stars. To earn you freedom, that 7-pillared worthy house, that your eyes might be shining for me when we came. Death seemed my servant on the road, till we were near and saw you waiting.
Through his friendship with Dahum and other Arabs working at the Karkamish site, Lawrence learned about the deep resentment they felt towards the Turks who governed them. For 4 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had ruled the Middle East, stretching Turkish influence from Constantinople to Mecca. But the empire was weakening. Turkey was now the sick man of Europe. Britain, France, and Russia were preparing to move in if the empire collapsed. That now seemed a real possibility. Europe was heading towards the First World War. The German Kaiser made a state visit to Turkey. The Germans wanted an alliance with the Turks. They offered military and strategic support, including the building of railways, particularly a new railway to Baghdad. Railways were strategically vital. They were the fastest way to carry trade and arms. In the tense international atmosphere, the new railway was of considerable interest to the foreign powers. The archaeological site where Lawrence was working sat on the route of the planned Baghdad Railway. He was about to enter his career in military intelligence. A letter in a collection at the British Museum includes an account from Lawrence about the building of the railway.
You asked about the railway, which now runs 4 trains a day. The line is to run round the walls of the Kelat and descend from the Euphrates. I will send you a few photos in a week. The station platform is to be 1,100 meters long. There are to be 24 stone buildings. They are working day and night shifts to hurry it on.
What we see at Carchemish is Lawrence being groomed to play the great game. People have spotted Lawrence, talent spotters. This is a guy who could be useful to us in the future, and let's try him out. Let's put him into this sort of environment. Let's get his language skills up. Let's get him managing people. Let's see what his mapping ability is like, photographic abilities, all these things which were practically important, tradecraft he was learning at Carchemish.
Sinai, 500 miles south of Carchemish. Lawrence was recruited to join a team preparing a secret military survey of the region. He had been sent, he wrote, as a cover on a political job. He took Dahum with him. With war looming, the Turks tracked any suspicious archaeologists.
They sent soldiers after me. They tried to stop me from going up Mount Hor, but we had lost or tired out all the soldiers and reached the hilltop quite alone.
Lawrence was learning and falling in love with the land with which he would become so dramatically associated.
Landscapes in childhood's dream were so vast and silent. Golden misty dawns and the strange peacefulness of nature.
Lawrence was home in Oxford when, on the 4th of August 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. 2 of his brothers joined up immediately. Lawrence hunted impatiently for a posting that would make use of his experience in Arabia and get him into the war.
Any young man in that era who couldn't get into uniform felt frustrated. This was the whole thing of Kitchener, your country needs you. You know, why are you being a wimp back at home when you ought to be doing the right thing out at the front line with the boys?
God, the horrible boredom of having nothing to do. I am longing for the Turks to declare war on the German side, so we will have a chance to take them on and kick the Turks out of Arabia.
At the beginning of the 20th century, the Arabs were still a disparate people. Their main focus was the religious capital Mecca and the family of the Grand Sharif Hussein bin Ali that claimed direct descent from the Prophet Muhammad. Hussein bin Ali was considering a revolt against Turkish rule. He dreamed of founding an Arab nation, bringing together the thousands of tribes and principalities under a single government.
The Arabs looked to be the rulers of themselves instead of the Turks. The Arabs wanted their independence and their unity. That was the short thing of the revolt.
It was about creating a single nation, a single state, that would be independent, that would be powerful, economically and militarily, and play its role on the international stage.
Hussein knew that a group of Arab intellectuals in Damascus had formed a secret society pledged to fight for Arab independence. He sent 2 of his sons, Abdullah and Faisal, to measure the political mood among the Turks and to test Arab support for a revolt. The Turkish army controlled the region and cracked down hard on any hint of rebellion. Mir Faisal was in Damascus when the Turks sentenced a revolutionary to death. Faisal campaigned for the man's freedom. He failed. It was not an isolated execution. Brutality was a hallmark of Turkish rule.
The Arabs were miserable following the secularization of the Ottoman state.
I remember those times as if it was a dream. How could they be good times? They were terrible.
Finally, the Turks entered the war on the German side. It was a decision that would have a dramatic impact on Middle Eastern history.
The decision was fatal. It was certainly the gravest mistake that the Ottoman Empire ever took in its entire history over the 5 centuries that it lasted.
As the British poured thousands more troops into mainland Europe, Lawrence had found a role in the war. His knowledge of Arabic and Arabia earned him a job in the British Army's intelligence section in Cairo. Men who served with him remember meeting a youthful but insignificant figure who often neglected to wear his belt or cap badge, whose hair was a little too long, and who had an instant disrespect for senior officers. But he would soon distinguish himself. The posting had landed him in a strategically vital part of the British Empire. Egypt gave the British control over their interests in the Near and Far East. It overlooked the Suez Canal and the precious land routes to India, and it gave them access to the great new resource, oil. Lawrence became involved in gathering intelligence about the possible Arab revolt. He interviewed prisoners and dissidents, ran agents, and helped to sponsor the idea of Arab insurrection. The British War Office saw that an Arab uprising could potentially destabilize the Turkish enemy. Lawrence's role gradually became more political. But he was largely office-bound and very conscious that while he sat safely in Cairo, his brothers were fighting the horrific war in Europe. Will was serving with the Royal Flying Corps. Frank was in the trenches. In May 1915, Frank was lost in action near Arras. Lawrence wrote home.
Frank's death was such a shock. The hugeness of this war has made one change one's perspective, and I for one can hardly see the details at all. I wonder where it will all end.
For the British, the war was going disastrously. Tens of thousands of Allied troops were being slaughtered at Gallipoli. Turkish victory meant that the enemy army was released for battle elsewhere. Troops were shipped south on the Hejaz Railway. The threat of a Turkish attack on British interests in Egypt, maybe even the precious Suez Canal, was becoming acute. The British War Office was increasingly concerned. They wanted information on the Turkish threat, and they wanted to recruit the Arabs to fight against the Turks. Urgent messages flew between London and the Cairo headquarters.
Please ascertain from prisoners the time the railway takes to get from Syria to Constantinople.
Work to prevent any alienation of the traditional loyalty of the Arabs to England.
How many troops can each train move?
Please offer all support to plans for an Arab revolt.
Lawrence believed in the revolt. He saw what it might gain for the Arabs and for British imperial interests.
It's a big game, and at last one worth playing.
In Damascus, the Turks were working just as hard to keep the Arabs under their influence and control. The Turkish commander in the region presented the Arab leader, Sharif Faisal, with a symbolic gift, a rifle from a British soldier slain at Gallipoli. The engraving read, "Booty captured in fighting, presented by Enver Pasha to Sharif Faisal." The message was plain. Look who's winning the war, and think twice before you take sides against us. The Arabs knew if they wanted self-rule, they had no choice but to go to war. They were also aware that their forces were ill-prepared to take on the organized and well-equipped Turkish military. They would need an ally to support and arm them. The obvious candidate was Great Britain. Sharif Hussein was on the brink of making his decision, but he needed guarantees.
He wanted Great Britain to declare itself on the side of Arab independence. He wanted to gain Arab independence, and he trusted the British, and he wanted to take a promise from them.
Hussein wanted a pledge that no foreign power would try and take Arab land from the Arabs after the war, that if they fought, there would be guaranteed self-rule. In 1915, opinion in the British government doubted the revolt would last, but it might delay the Turkish advance. On that basis, the War Office was happy to promise anything. Lord Kitchener authorized the dropping of propaganda sheets. They declared the British promise of no intervention in an Arab state if the Arab nation assists England in the war.
They believed the promise. They believed it. They believed in the good word of Great Britain, and of course that encouraged them to rise.
On the back of that promise, Sharif Hussein called his people to war.
Arab forces have attacked the Turkish garrison at Medina.
Tribesmen under command of Emirs Abdullah and Faisal have moved north towards Turkish lines.
It's a big game, and at last one worth playing.
Lawrence had the vision and the ability to see things in a much wider context than other British officials. He did believe that this was a movement of national liberation, and he did believe that the Arabs were capable of enjoying independence and having sovereignty as a new nation.
Within weeks, the Arabs had victories to boast. They captured the coastal towns of Yambo and Rabia. The Turkish garrison near Medina surrendered.
It was as if the whole Roman Empire started to crumble, as if Hannibal had conquered Rome. This is how it felt, that the hour of liberation had arrived. The Arabs had begun to earn their independence, and all they had to do is to continue in the same way.
But then the Arabs began to meet Turkish artillery and German aircraft. The revolt came to a crashing halt. The revolt had been limited to just a few thousand tribesmen. There was little or no central command. Most of all, they lacked modern weapons. Reports reaching London suggested the revolt had already run its course. The skeptics in Whitehall were not surprised.
The communications from Cairo are hardly encouraging. The Arab cause is evidently very weak cement.
The prospect of an Arabia united seems very remote.
I predict the collapse of the movement within months.
Lawrence was sent to find out if the Arab leaders felt the revolt had a future. It would be a dangerous expedition. He was heading into some of the fiercest desert in the world, and there was a real threat of attack by bandits or capture by the Turks. Lawrence appeared to embrace that risk.
First one, and then another of my brothers has been killed. They were both younger than I am, and it doesn't seem right somehow that I should go on peacefully in Cairo.
Lawrence always wanted to be the hero, but now he must have also felt that he really had to do something real. And I'm sure that was the motivating force of those deaths, that he had to get in now and do his bit.
Lawrence believed that the revolt was failing because of lack of real leadership. He was looking for someone who might be a figurehead, who might have the character to relaunch the battle. He headed north towards Wadi Safra to meet Amir Faisal. Their relationship would eventually drive the war in the desert.
They were short of funds, short of arms. The leadership was not happy with the whole situation. So many Arab officers actually started to desert and leave the camp of Sharif Hussein. So when Lawrence appeared on the scene, everybody felt that perhaps this stranger could do something to break this deadlock.
Faisal and his men explained why they thought the revolt was failing.
He was deeply discouraged. His men were tired. He had lost many of them. They were in every way ill-equipped. Little flour and rice, few rifles, insufficient ammunition, no technical help, no information. I said that my coming was expressly to learn what they lacked and to report it.
They accepted Lawrence as an officer representing a power, an ally, who could provide the revolt with weaponry and funds. They respected him because he represented the British government, no more or less.
Lawrence would begin his work with Faisal as liaison officer attached to the Arab forces. He began to draw up a shopping list of Arab requests.
Rifles, 2,000. Ammunition, 100 boxes. Dynamite, money, £16,000. Tents, socks, 2 pairs. Field glasses, if possible. Rope, candles. Lewis guns, cigarettes, 6,000. Chinese silk, camel saddles.
The revolt was on its feet again. But British support for the Arabs was not popular with all her allies. France sent her ambassador, Georges Picot, for urgent meetings with the British government. France had always wanted a colony in the East. They claimed they had shaped Syria since the Crusades and argued that Syria was as good as French territory. They feared that if the Arab revolt succeeded, their claim might be threatened. So they suggested a secret deal with the British, dividing Arabia between them. Before the war had even been won, the British promise of Arab independence was critically undermined. For now, Lawrence knew nothing of the backroom deals. He was spending most of his time with Faisal in the desert. Faisal suggested that if Lawrence was to live with the Arabs, he should dress like an Arab. It would help the tribes know how to respond to him.
It is the custom of the Arabs that when someone joins them, he becomes one of them. He was a man who lived with them, among them, like someone from one of the tribes who had joined the revolution.
Lawrence argued the practicality of his new uniform. Others suspected it had more to do with his romantic self-image.
It's appropriate that he wear Arab dress because he wants to represent himself as a person of stature who fits in with the Arabs. But it was always a bit of self-mocking in this. In other words, it was a play acting. He enjoyed it at one level, but he was play acting at another level. But it worked.
Lawrence began to explore how he could harness the Arab style of desert warfare.
Most wars are of contact. Ours should be a war of detachment. We were an influence, an idea, a thing intangible drifting about like a gas.
The Arabs began to accept their new recruit.
They considered him as a friend, as a man working actively on the side of the Arabs. Of course, they respected him a great lot, of course, when he went on the raids and planted dynamite. They greatly respected him.
But some Arab historians suggest that at least in the early days, Lawrence's role was as little more than a technical advisor.
Lawrence's role in the revolt was as an explosives expert. That's all. He instructed men how to use explosives and train them to blow up bridges and trains. Nothing else.
In London, Georges Picot and Sir Mark Sykes entered detailed negotiations dividing up the map of Arabia. The French would get Lebanon and a swathe of land across what is today Syria. The British would take Palestine and most of Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. The deal would be called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It completely ignored the promise the British had made to the Arabs.
It was a very treacherous thing. There was a feeling of betrayal a feeling that, to my mind, and I'm telling you as honestly as I can, it really has been the cause of the trauma that we have been under, the terrible conditions that we have been existing under for the last 100 years. It's a horrible thing.
For months, London kept the agreement secret. Eventually, word began to leak out among the British officers. Lawrence had to decide whether to tell Faisal his men might be dying for nothing. It's not clear what he knew or when he knew it, but by his own admission in 7 Pillars, Lawrence did not tell the whole truth.
I had to join the conspiracy and assured the men of their reward. I risked the fraud on my conviction that Arab help was necessary to our cheap and speedy victory. Better we win and break our word than lose.
He certainly felt he deceived them. How much he actually deceived them, he was always exaggerating the darkness of his own role, which gave people lots of ammunition.
Lawrence was being sucked into a betrayal that would haunt him for the rest of his life.
I assured them that England kept her word in letter and spirit. In this comfort, they performed fine things.
The blame into Lawrence may be he gave promises in the name of Great Britain. So the blame to him was a personal blame. Personal blame that you were not honest with us.
Perhaps if I had been honest then, but we had dreams, and I could see a way that we could win in spite of Sykes and Pico and the rest.
Britain's friendship with the Arabs was not for the good of the Arabs. It was a political friendship aimed at getting the Turks out and taking control of Arab territory.
He was a British officer serving his country, but of course he has his own ideas of serving his country.
We had dreams. I salved myself in the hope that by leading these Arabs madly in the final victory, we could still win. We could still win.
Lawrence began to hatch a plan that would allow the Arabs to take control of their own destiny. He convinced Faisal that if the Arab revolt could reach the city of Damascus before the other allies, they could force the British to give them their independence. Damascus would be the key.
Damascus is a great city from old days, and it was also the center of the group of nationalists who originally thought of the revolt.
In the psyche of the Arab, from Morocco in the west to Iraq in the east, there is a special spot in their heart for Damascus.
Damascus was the prize.
One of the greatest challenges facing Lawrence was how to hold the tribes together. He was suffering with bouts of malaria and dysentery when an incident threatened to rupture one of the fragile alliances at the heart of the revolt. Had been killed belonged to one tribe, the killer to another. Tribal law demanded the guilty man be executed. But if he was killed by another Arab, a new dispute would erupt. Lawrence took on the responsibility of the execution.
I told Hamid that he must die. I made him enter a narrow gully, a dank twilight place. Hamid cried out to me, again and again. I gave him a few moments' delay, which he spent crying on the ground. Then I made him rise.
As he lay in fever, Lawrence claims he suddenly saw the revolt in broader perspective. This is where he hatched his master plan, the plan to attack Aqaba. Aqaba was the one port on the Red Sea that could supply the push north to Damascus. The Turks still held it. It was notoriously well defended. Lawrence now decided that the Arabs must take it for themselves. But how? From the north, from Al-Jafr, came one of the men who would enter the legend of the Arab revolt, Auda Abu Tayyeh.
When Auda entered the revolt, all the tribes who might have feared or resisted the revolt joined with Auda. Auda was the hero, the knight of the revolt.
Auda was a hero. Auda was a leader, the head of his tribe. He was a champion of the oppressed. And when the leaders of the revolt asked for his help, Auda gave it.
Faisal had sent a message to ask Auda to come to him. The Aqaba attack was so crucial to the revolt that Lawrence and Faisal thought they must meet him eye to eye.
They drew aside a pace or two and looked at each other. A splendidly unlikely pair, Faisal the prophet and Auda the warrior, each immediately understanding the other. I knew from the force and directness of the man that we would attain our end. He had come down to us like a knight-errant.
Faisal presented Lawrence with the rifle the Turks had given him in Damascus, the gun of a British soldier slain at Gallipoli.
They called Lawrence the Wolf, which meant an adventurer, daring, brave. Those are the qualities of the wolf. Those are Arab qualities. And the Arab men loved that in him.
The plan called for a small group to ride across the open desert, recruiting tribes along the way. Then they would ride out of the mountains and hit the Turkish defenses where they would least expect it. It was just the sort of expedition that most appealed to Lawrence. The Arabs using their desert skills to even the odds, as reckless as it was brave. But even some of the Arabs doubted they would succeed. The struggle through the desert took its toll. 200 miles of dirt, heat, thirst, and exhaustion.
We marched on over monotonous, glittering sand, and over those worse stretches of polished mud. They blazed back the sun into our faces. It was not a steady pressure, but a pain, ebbing and flowing. The barren desert threatened to defeat us.
On the morning of July the 6th, they stood in the mountains with Aqaba at their feet. The future of the whole revolt depended on this attack. 500 lightly armed Arabs against the heavily fortified Turkish stronghold.
Aqaba. Aqaba.
Took the Turks completely by surprise. Aqaba fell. It cost the Arabs only 2 dead. The revolt had scored its first major success. From here, it could reach across Arabia, to Syria, to Iraq. Until now, British headquarters had viewed the revolt as a skirmish, a sideshow. The Aqaba victory changed that view. Lawrence and the Arabs would become a crucial part of the war in the desert. Leaving Auda in charge at Aqaba, Lawrence insisted on reporting his own victory. The news could not have reached the Allied command at a better time. The Allies had just suffered tremendous defeats with heavy losses. Generals were being replaced, and British officers fighting with the Arabs had been questioning whether they could be led to any useful purpose. Lawrence had proved them wrong. He was recommended for the Victoria Cross, promoted to Major, and celebrated in the War Office. But he knew there was still so much to achieve. The future of Arabia was in the hands of the tiny army celebrating at Aqaba. And Lawrence still faced his personal battle between loyalty to Britain and loyalty to his Arab friends. Both would be decided if the race to Damascus could be won. At the height of the First World War, battles raged across the Middle East. An army of Arabs joined the war on the Allied side. The British had promised the Arabs independence if they would help defeat the Turks. Fighting with the Arabs was an extraordinary Englishman, T.E. Lawrence. He helped arm and direct the Arab campaign. He told the Arabs the British government would guarantee their independence if they fought on the British side. But behind the scenes, promises were being broken. Lawrence knew the Arabs could only get their freedom if they could win the race to Damascus.
This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
October 1917. Lawrence and the Arab army were concentrating their guerrilla attacks on the Hijaz Railway, disrupting the Turkish supply routes. A year earlier, the Arabs had been a poorly led and badly equipped force. Now, they were winning significant victories and inflicting serious damage on the Turkish military machine. Four months earlier, the Arabs had seized the strategically vital port of Aqaba. Supplies now flowed freely to Allied and Arab armies. The victory had forced British commanders to take Lawrence and the Arab armies seriously. They were no longer an unpredictable sideshow, but an important part of the overall campaign. The Allies were preparing a new offensive that would move north along the coast of Palestine towards Jerusalem. The Arabs would take a parallel route, forcing the Turks to fight on two fronts. After Jerusalem, the goal was Damascus, the Arab political heart. The Arab leadership, especially Faisal, trusted that if the Turks could be defeated and the Arabs marched into Damascus, they could claim their independence. Lawrence knew it was not so straightforward. The Arabs had entered the war on the back of a British promise guaranteeing Arab independence if they helped the Allies in the fight against the Turks.
The Arabs believed especially in the word of Great Britain. The word of Great Britain was greatly respected.
What Lawrence now knew, but the Arabs did not, was that the British had already broken that promise.
It was evident to me that if we won the war, these promises were dead paper.
The British government had made a secret agreement with the French called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It planned to carve up Arab land between Britain and France, leaving no place for Arab self-rule.
It was, to put it mildly, the greatest betrayal or the breach of promise between the British and the Arabs that has taken place in history.
Lawrence was finding it harder and harder to justify the lie, especially when he had to bury his Arab comrades.
An individual death is like a pebble dropped in water. Rings of sorrow widened out from it. We could not afford casualties.
By this point in the war, the Arabs had already lost thousands of men.
They were killed in great numbers, but their freedom was worth the sacrifices. They believed in liberty and they fought courageously and mightily, whatever the cost.
Lawrence was looking for a way out of the campaign. Even before Aqaba, the weight of the responsibility had threatened to overwhelm him. Ridden with guilt, he had scrawled his feelings into a message pad, a note to his immediate superior.
I've decided to go off alone to Damascus, hoping to get killed on the way. For all sakes, clear up this show before it goes further. We are calling them to fight for us on a lie, and I can't stand it.
He never sent the note.
When all is said and done, Lawrence was a British subject, serving a British imperial interest. He was a British officer, and he made no bones about that. And I have respect for him for that. Why should he serve somebody else? He will be a traitor.
I had to join the conspiracy. Arab help was necessary to our cheap and speedy victory in the East.
He was helping the Arabs, he was fighting with them, he was doing his best for them because, it was, to me, it is so clear and it is so plain. Because if the Arabs win, it will be a help for the British Empire in its war effort.
There was also a personal motive. In the dedication of his book, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, Lawrence promised to win freedom for the person he loved.
I drew these tides of men into my hands and wrote my will across the sky in stars to earn you freedom.
The dedication was to Dahum, Lawrence's friend from his days as an archaeologist. Dahum was now stranded in enemy territory. Lawrence wrote that there was not a day when he did not think of him. Lawrence would spend the rest of the war trying to fulfill the British promise, his promise to the Arabs.
They had joined the war to win freedom. Therefore, for every reason, strategical, tactical, moral, we were going on.
The Arab army moved north, ambushing trains and raiding Turkish outposts.
On November the 11th, a detachment of the Northern Army of Sharif Faisal attacked the railway and troop train.
At Tel El Shabab, 2 locomotives destroyed. Turkish casualties 100. Arab casualties 7 men.
The Turks had put a price on the heads of Lawrence, Auda and Faisal. With every successful attack, it rose. It was the sort of recognition that delighted Lawrence. Better, he said, than a medal or a knighthood from the king. Lawrence now moved to a new base in the ancient Crusader castle at Azraq. He was treading again in the footsteps of his heroes.
The early shepherd kings loved this place, and Roman legionaries languished here in yet earlier times. Azraq's unfathomable silence was steeped in knowledge of wandering poets, champions, and lost kingdoms. It was magically haunted.
The presence of Lawrence and Faisal's army made a huge impression on local people.
Mr. Lawrence and King Faisal were staying at Azraq here, issuing all the instructions from his headquarters. In the upper room, you go up the stairs and pass through there. On your way up, Mr. Lawrence and King Faisal and my father stayed together for 2 years.
Lawrence wrote home to his mother.
You will be pleased to hear I at last have a floor to sleep on and a roof over my head. A stone roof, but a roof nonetheless.
With Azraq as their base, the Arab forces launched themselves into a new phase of the offensive, picking out important strategic targets. Lawrence began to seek out danger. In some ways, he said, he was testing his legitimacy for the role as leader of the Arabs.
I'm not going to last out this game much longer. Nerves going and temper wearing thin. But we ride on.
Lawrence traveled north to scout for an attack on the important Turkish stronghold at Daraa. In 1917, Daraa was a vital railway junction on the route to Damascus. The Arabs would need to capture it before they could advance. For Lawrence, Daraa would become a place of the very darkest memories. The only account of what happened is Lawrence's own, and it is the subject of considerable controversy. He described it as, "That night I shouldn't tell you about, because decent men don't talk about such things." He said it wounded him worse than any other event of the war. The soldiers were suspicious. Lawrence claimed he was a Circassian from the north to explain away his blue eyes. But the Turks were unconvinced, and according to Lawrence, they had other things on their minds.
He began to fawn on me, saying how white and fresh I was, how fine my hands and feet. I thought he was going to kill me. But he only pulled up a fold of flesh over my ribs and worked the point through. Then he told the corporal to take me out and teach me everything. I locked my teeth to endure this thing which lapped itself round me, like a flaming wire about my body. A delicious warmth, probably sexual, was swelling through me. I knew next that I was being dragged about by two men as if to split me in two, while a third man rode me astride. That night, I gave away the only possession we are born into life with, our bodily integrity.
But then, Lawrence claims, the Turks dressed his wounds and allowed him to escape. It was one of several elements of the story that have led people to doubt his account.
I think that Dara was an invention. It never happened. To my own research, to my mind, I went myself to Dara later on, and I met people, and I spent 2 nights in the Huran around Dara. And I am convinced he never went to Dara. It never happened. It was an invention.
I don't think the rape at Dara happened in the way that Lawrence suggests it did. I think that Lawrence probably had some sort of homosexual encounter whilst he was in Arabia. It may have been a rape. It may have been a situation that he led himself into almost deliberately, which ended in some sort of rape or something like it. But I'm convinced, my own gut reaction, and I've studied him for a long time, is it didn't happen the way he suggested it did.
Some believe Lawrence invented the story to represent the punishment he felt he deserved for deceiving his Arab friends.
There was a wound that was constantly feeding his activities, feeding his need for sacrifice, for redemption, for higher purpose, for fulfilling a vision, and was constantly being repeated. That wound was constantly being reactivated, driving him to still more extreme, greater efforts to fulfill that higher vision.
There was no escape for me. I took up again my mantle of fraud in the East. With my certain contempt for half measures, I took it up completely.
Now British forces moved towards Jerusalem. Ahead of the advance, the Turks abandoned the holy city. Jerusalem fell. The news reached Lawrence. He hurried to be part of the celebrations. For the man who modeled his early life on the Crusaders, marching into Jerusalem with a Christian army, freeing it from Ottoman rule, would be a crowning moment. In deference to history, British Commander-in-Chief General Allenby led the Allies into the city on foot. Among the marchers is the small figure of T.E. Lawrence, wearing a borrowed uniform. He was suddenly a British officer again.
I think you can see where Lawrence's loyalties lay, perhaps in the way he decides to dress. Sometimes he's there in all his magnificent Arab garb with the golden headdress and all the rest of it, dressed as an Arab prince. Occasionally we see him in rather scruffy khaki. And then quite often we see him between the two. He's got his khaki on, but he's got a keffiyeh and a headdress and all the rest of it. And there's this sort of, he's between the two. He's standing as the bridge between the Arabs and the British Empire. And I suspect that's where he saw himself, really.
The capture of Jerusalem caused celebration among Christians around the world. It brought the war in the East sharply to world attention. This was the time of some of the worst defeats on the Western Front. Now, at last, the Allies had something to cheer about. But for the Arabs, the victory would have enormous repercussions. A group of Zionists were lobbying the British government to support the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. With the region now under their control, the British felt able to dispose of it as they saw fit. British Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour wrote a letter to one of the Zionist leaders, Lord Rothschild. In it, he spelt out the British position.
His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people.
The declaration flew in the face of the British promise made to Sharif Hussein, the promise that Palestine would be Arab land.
Lord Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, writes a letter to Lord Rothschild, who at that time happens to be a great financier living in Paris, promising the land that he doesn't own, promising to someone who doesn't belong.
The Arab army knew nothing of this promise. The British continued to reassure the Arabs that they would get their independence. They even designed a flag for the new Arab nation. Everything to keep them fighting the war. Lawrence was also ignorant of this new secret deal. Celebrating the victory with Emir Faisal, he was back in his Arab guise. Among those observing the celebrations was an American journalist called Lowell Thomas. Thomas had been sent by the US government to gather propaganda that might encourage Americans to enter the war. Lawrence was described to Thomas as the uncrowned king of Arabia. It was a brand that Thomas would famously exploit. Lowell Thomas spent 8 days in the desert filming Lawrence and the Arab army. Lawrence could not have guessed what those few days would mean for his future.
Lowell Thomas started the legend of Lawrence. He was the man. He, as you know, he's an American propagandist, and he started the legend.
Lowell Thomas's contribution to the Lawrence legend is absolutely critical. I mean, people today don't realize that Lawrence of Arabia didn't exist in the First World War. Lawrence of Arabia was a creation of a rather slick American journalist called Lowell Thomas.
With Jerusalem captured, the push towards Damascus gathered momentum. The British-led Allied forces headed in from the west. The Arabs hurried up the eastern flank. Lawrence now knew about the Balfour Declaration. He realized that the odds on the Arabs being granted their independence were lengthening all the time. And the closer he led them to Damascus, the closer came the moment when his deception would be exposed. His only hope was to have the Arabs in Damascus ahead of the other allies, armed and secure. Then perhaps Britain might be forced to negotiate a fair peace. As the combined forces of the Allied and Arab armies neared Damascus, the Turks realized they were beaten and fled. Damascus was liberated.
The people met the Arab army with cheers, with the flowers. They were very happy.
They were rejoicing, dancing, clapping. They thought that the day of liberation is the day of salvation.
They knew they had won their victory, their freedom. They had won independence. They were elated.
Emir Faisal was driven into the city as a conqueror.
Faisal had become the new national hero, and people believed that this person was their liberator.
There would be arguments about which troops entered the city first, British, Australian or Arab. But it was the Arab flag given to them by the British government, which flew over the city hall. The race to Damascus had been won. Lawrence had succeeded, but he was acutely aware of the uncertainties that lay ahead for the Arabs. At meetings between Allied and Arab leaders, Faisal discovered the extent of the British double dealing, and specifically he heard about the Sykes-Picot Agreement with the French. Faisal objected strongly. Allied commanders questioned Lawrence about what he had told the Arabs. Faisal walked out. The two men who had fought together so hard for this day now went their separate ways. Lawrence makes no mention of this in Seven Pillars. He says only that he was exhausted.
I made to Allenby the only request I ever asked him for myself: leave to go. In the end, he agreed, and then at once, I knew how much I was sorry.
By the time the days in Damascus are winding down, he's a mess. I mean, he just wants to get out. But he's already got in mind he's going to go fight. The real battle is now going to be at the peace conference. It's not going to be in the Middle East anymore. He knows that. So even though he's seemingly living out what looks like his own personal desperation and exhaustion, he's already planning for the next move.
Lawrence wrote a farewell letter to Cairo headquarters.
I'm off out of Egypt. This old war is closing and my use is gone. My regards to the staff. We were an odd little set, and we have, I expect, changed history in the Near East. I wonder how the powers will let the Arabs get on.
For Lawrence, there was a bitter grief to come. He received news that Dahum, his Carchemish friend, had died of typhoid, just too soon to hear of the victory Lawrence had won for him.
Death seemed my servant on the road till we were near and saw you waiting. When you smiled, and in sorrowful envy he outran me and took you apart into his quietness.
As Lawrence arrived home, Britain was celebrating the end of the war. In government, working committees were already discussing how to reshape the map in the aftermath of the conflict. Lawrence was called to brief the War Cabinet's Eastern Committee, who would help decide the future of Arabia.
Gentlemen, Colonel Lawrence.
He presented his plan for the region, complete with a new map, the names of those he thought should rule, and a definition of the British Empire as a partnership of nations. He was at the height of his influence. The committee would hear him out, but he was far from certain that they would take his advice. So Lawrence launched a high-profile lobbying campaign to draw attention to the Arab cause.
Lawrence felt absolutely furious because he had persuaded men to risk everything, to risk their lives. He felt that all the promises he'd made had been made in good faith, and that the Arabs essentially, and particularly Faisal, had been deceived. I think Lawrence felt really pissed off.
Lawrence's letters were published in the Times.
Sir, your correspondent wishes to draw the reader's attention to the extraordinary courage of the Arab nation's support of the British war. Pledges were made in His Majesty's name, which our nation is beholden to meet.
The letters created tremendous waves in government circles. But it was not enough. Lawrence realized the tide was turning against him, that elements in the government were blocking moves for Arab independence. He would have to make his arguments heard another way. Lawrence traveled to Buckingham Palace to join other heroes receiving their medals from King George. For his achievements in the Desert War, he was to be presented with the Distinguished Service Order and the Companionship of the Bath, two of the highest awards a Briton could receive. But when his moment came, Lawrence refused the honors.
Why he rejected his medals from the king is very simple. The only way he could show his dissatisfaction for what had transpired was to say to the king, "No, thank you. I don't mean to offend you, Your Majesty, but I really feel I can't take these awards from the state." I mean, a tremendous break with decorum.
English society was appalled. It was an unprecedented snub for the king. Lawrence had made his voice heard. But the same newspapers that reported his royal insult began to edit his letters. The Times cut the most controversial sections, and its editor wrote a column supporting the status quo. The establishment was closing ranks. Lawrence did persuade the British to invite Faisal to London. Perhaps with the man on the ground, people would talk. Lawrence brokered a meeting that might seem extraordinary today. He introduced Faisal to Chaim Weizmann, leader of the Zionists. They had dinner in the Piccadilly home of Lord Rothschild to discuss how the Jews and the Arabs might become allies, to secure what both parties wanted from the post-war settlement. As Faisal put it, we are the two main branches of the same Semitic family. But the British government showed little interest. Officials were more concerned about their own claims than those of the Arabs. Lawrence realized he would have to take the Arab cause to the international arena. Everything, he wrote, depends on the conference. The peace conference of the War to End All Wars had begun in Paris. The French themselves would be the key obstacle to Arab aims. They wanted Syria for themselves. They even tried to stop Faisal from reaching Paris and questioned his right to attend the conference. With Lawrence's help, he argued his way into the proceedings. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson arrived with his famous 14 points, the principles that he argued should allow peoples to govern themselves. Point number 12 specifically called for the Arabs to be given the opportunity of autonomous development. Lawrence and Faisal would use this to argue their case. But first, they would have to persuade the conference organizers to give them a hearing.
The Middle East wasn't the most important subject that was being discussed. Remember, Europe has just had this terrible bloodletting in the Somme and elsewhere, and they had to have a reconstruction. That was the real issue. But Lawrence stole the limelight. He was, as usual, making the most of the situation, and he was playing with important people, and he tried to get Faisal's issues pushed up the agenda, and he succeeded.
Lawrence and Faisal presented the Arab case to the Council of World Leaders. They could do no more. The Council would now meet and deliberate, and the Arabs must wait for the outcome. Lawrence was acutely aware that this was history in the making. In Paris, he began to write 7 Pillars of Wisdom.
The dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act out their dreams with open eyes to make it possible. This I did. I meant to make a new nation.
The peace conference had reached its conclusion. The delegates signed the Treaty of Versailles. For the Arabs, President Wilson's 14 points would seem a distant memory.
Well, it was 14 points, literally, for everybody else except for the Arabs.
The victors had drawn new maps for the post-war world. The Arabs were pushed south out of Syria, where the French won their claim, west out of Mesopotamia, where the British took power, and out of Palestine and Jerusalem, where the Zionists would have a homeland under a British mandate.
The borders were not designed to meet with Arab interests or with Arab hopes and aspirations. They were a reflection of imperial designs between the British and the French on the one hand, and also the Zionists on the other hand.
The big issue was Palestine. When the British had made their pre-war promises to the Arabs, Palestine had been included in territory that was to come under Arab rule. The Arab leader, Sharif Hussein, refused to accept any settlement that did not include all Arab territory.
But the Arabs believed and still believe that Great Britain honestly promised that it will recognize a united and independent Arab state in the East.
That breach of promise, I think, to a large degree, until the moment that we are living, and perhaps well into maybe the next 100 years or more, will determine the affairs of the Arab world and Europe and the Middle East.
The Arabs decided to defy the superpowers and take the initiative and ignore the Versailles Treaty. They declared self-government. For the first time in 5 centuries, the Arabs were free of foreign rule. Emir Faisal was crowned king. The Arab dream became reality.
They thought that they will have prosperity, they will have democracy, they will have new schools, new roads, new hospitals. The West will treat them differently. So this was the point at which the Arabs thought they had finally begun to build a new future for themselves and become masters of their own house.
5 months later, the dream was over. The French army arrived in Syria to enforce the treaty. Barbed wire went up in the streets. The French threatened airstrikes if the Arabs resisted. King Faisal was ordered to leave. He was left to wait for a train like any other passenger. As he traveled through Transjordan, Faisal was met by a company of British soldiers. He didn't know if they were there to arrest him or to honor him. He was invited to inspect them, a last gesture on his way into exile. Lawrence had rushed home from Paris on news that his father was gravely ill. He was too late. He was left to mourn for his father and for the Arabs.
We lived many lives in those swirling campaigns, never sparing ourselves. Then the new world dawned. The old men came out again and took our victory to remake in the likeness of the former world they knew. Youth would win, but had not learned to keep, and it was pitiably weak against age. We stammered that we worked for a new haven and a new earth, and they thanked us kindly and made their peace.
Faisal believed that Lawrence was a good friend to the Arabs. But he knew Faisal was a statesman. He knew that Lawrence was an employee by his government. So he shouldn't be blamed because he is not the government.
I think that he thought that the Arabs had been sold down the river. I think he realised that he's played his part in that, and that generally he was so concerned by what had happened that he just wanted to run away from it.
Ironically, at his moment of defeat, at his personal lowest ebb, Britain and the world were about to celebrate Lawrence as a star. Lowell Thomas, the American who had tracked Lawrence in the desert, brought his film lecture about the Desert War to London. It would turn Lawrence into a prototype matinee idol. He was flattered and appalled by his celebrity.
To have news value is to have a tin can tied to one's tail.
A friend wrote that he liked to be recognized, but not to let people see. He had a genius for backing into the limelight. He had become the hero he always dreamed of being.
I think there are lots of people in life who may have aspired to become the hero, to become the star, whatever it might be, and who once they've got there have found it was hollow. And I think in Lawrence's case, all the more so, because it wasn't just a case of him becoming the hero, it was a case of him becoming the hero at great cost to other people, which he realised.
He wrote that he had thrown away his medals for someone to find one day and to wonder at their history. Lawrence had retreated to Oxford and the safety of the academic world when he was contacted by Winston Churchill. Churchill had been appointed colonial secretary and told to sort out the chaos in the East. He offered Lawrence a job as his advisor. It would be Lawrence's last effort in Arabia, his last chance at redemption. Churchill, Lawrence, and other Middle East experts traveled to Cairo for another conference. Britain was again carving out new nations on the map, but this time Lawrence would have a direct say in where the borders were drawn and a chance to make good on his promises. In Transjordan, Emir Abdullah took the throne. In the new nation of Iraq, Faisal would be king.
When Faisal was established in Iraq and Abdullah in Jordan, the nation saw in Britain a spark of conscience. Even though things were not as they had hoped for, it was something.
Lawrence was pleased with what he had achieved for the Arabs. He wrote that Britain had quit Arabia having kept her promises.
I don't think that was a true statement or an honest statement on the part of Lawrence, to put it mildly.
I think he says that because he's trying to feel okay about something which is not okay. I think that's false. I think he's, like many of us, I think we want to believe certain things are true when they're not. I mean, we'll often say, well, I did okay. I acquitted myself all right here. And we kind of know we didn't.
The Arabs saw the Cairo settlement as window dressing. They felt they had fought a war for nothing. Now they rebelled. The British and French responded with airstrikes and gas attacks. Tens of thousands of Arabs died. Baghdad and Damascus lay in ruins.
I think what strikes you when you look back at this, you think nothing changes. all the issues are the same issues. You know, you've got Zionism, Arab nationalism, tribesmen who are fanatical, the concerns about how you're going to suppress that fanaticism. It's all the same issues.
Lawrence was near to a breakdown.
I am so tired. I want to lie down and sleep and not wake up.
For 8 years, he'd been through this horror of constant tension, constant violence. He was near to an emotional breakdown. And the toll of being so involved in close-up events of violence for which he took exaggerated responsibility eventually did drive him out of a prominent role in public life.
Name?
Ross John Hume, 352-087, sir.
Lawrence would spend his middle age in hiding, trying to escape his celebrity and responsibility by joining the ranks of the Royal Air Force.
What are these?
Superficial wound, sir.
Answer my question.
A barbed wire tear, sir, over the fence.
God. And these? Punishment?
Persuasion, sir.
The hero of Damascus, the uncrowned king of Arabia, would spend his middle age trying to shun responsibility and avoid the attention of the press.
If ever there was a man squeezed right out dry by over-experience, then it's me. I don't think I'll be fit for anything ever again.
He wrote to friends that although he struggled with the drudgery of barrack life, he wouldn't leave the RAF for any job he was offered. But the calm wouldn't last. Within months of his enlistment, the press found him. He was dismissed from the RAF because his presence there might cause the service an embarrassment. "Damn the press," he wrote. He changed his name again and spent the next decade moving from Air Force to Army and back again, from posting to posting, trying to find somewhere he could be anonymous. He rented a small cottage in Dorset, Clouds Hill, which he used as a hideaway when on leave. The Greek inscription above the door reads, "Does not care." But his letters were full of doubts about the justness of the Middle East settlement.
Surely my share in helping to settle the Middle East atones me for my misdeeds in the war. I think so anyway. If Iraq continues to put up a decent show over 3 generations, then the revolt was worthwhile.
But Faisal's line did not last. He ruled for just 10 years, then died of heart disease in a Swiss clinic. His son reigned until 1958, when he and his entire family were executed in a revolution. "30 years after Lawrence's death, a man came forward with an account of how Lawrence paid him for beatings. It has been largely accepted by those who have studied the evidence. Some suggest that Lawrence was seeking to punish himself, others that it was for sexual gratification.
We have to be compassionate about Lawrence. He had certainly seen a great deal of death and had killed people and watched people being killed, and that must have had quite an effect on him, taken quite a toll. And you combine that perhaps with repressed homosexuality, who knows, and you get some very strange reactions.
In 1935, aged 46, Lawrence left the RAF and his service life for the last time. He planned a quiet retirement at Clouds Hill. But with Britain and Europe again facing the prospect of war, the hero of Arabia was in demand. Churchill wanted him to command the nation's home defense. The British fascists wanted him to join their leadership. Others wanted him to act as ambassador for peace. Lawrence, T.E. Shaw, as he now called himself, would not be prized from his cottage. He sent cards announcing his retreat from the world.
Wild mares would not drag me from here now.
Lawrence's purest escape was speed. He was thrilled at driving his powerful bikes as hard as they would go.
Lawrence liked speed because it stopped him thinking. He found a freedom from the world of the intellect and a descent into the world of feeling and freedom with it. He loved speed. He was a speed freak.
On May the 13th, 1935, Lawrence rode to the post office to send a telegram. He was on his way home when he lost control of the bike, swerved to avoid two cyclists, and crashed. He never regained consciousness. Lawrence died 6 days later. The press reported his death like today they might cover the death of a superstar. There were reports of plots and assassination. Lawrence was simply too great a character for people to accept he could die in an ordinary accident. From the Arabs who knew him, there was grief too. Men from tribes and towns where Lawrence had lived and fought sent their respects. Tell them in England his heart was steel, of manhood the man, in freedom free, a mind without an equal. There were representatives from King George, ambassadors, generals and statesmen, Churchill among them. Lawrence, Churchill said, was one of those beings whose pace of life was faster and more intense than what is normal. So he flew best in the hurricane. In the heroic period, he found himself in perfect relation both to men and events. He will live in history.